All right, here we go. The Maya collapse. One morning in the 9th century, a city of 70,000 people simply stopped. Not gradually, not after a siege, not after a plague swept the streets. The construction crews never showed up. The scribes left their inscriptions mid-sentence. Temples stood half-finished, their stones still waiting for the next layer. Tikal, once the greatest city in the Western Hemisphere, was left to the jungle without a single recorded explanation. Before the collapse, the Maya lowlands were the most densely administered civilization in the Americas. 30 major cities operated simultaneously, connected by trade, diplomacy, and a calendar system more precise than anything Europe would produce for another 8 centuries. Kings commissioned monuments. Astronomers tracked Venus to the minute. The infrastructure of an entire world was humming, and it had been humming for hundreds of years. Between 800 and 1000 AD, every single one of those 30 cities was abandoned. Climate scientist Douglas Kennett published sediment core data in 2012 showing a 200-year megadrought beginning around 820 AD. The southern lowlands, which had no geological access to groundwater, saw an estimated 90% population collapse within a century. Meanwhile, northern cities like Chichen Itza, sitting directly above natural sinkholes called cenotes, kept thriving. The people didn't disappear. They followed the water north and never looked back. What makes this disturbing isn't the drought. Droughts happen. What's disturbing is the silence. The Maya were meticulous record keepers. They inscribed births, deaths, wars, eclipses, and dynastic squabbles onto stone with obsessive precision. 39 competing kingdoms documented their own politics in exhaustive detail. And yet, not one of them left an inscription explaining the abandonment. Not a warning, not a farewell, not even a record of the decision to leave. The record simply stops. We have the drought data. We have the empty cities. We have the bones of a civilization that walked away in near total silence. But the question that lingers over every abandoned temple in the jungle is the same one the stones can't answer. If you knew your world was ending, why didn't you write it down? The Roman fall. On the 4th of September, 476 AD, a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus was summoned before a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer and told to take off his crown. No army had marched on Rome. No walls had been breached. Odoacer simply handed the boy a pension, sent him to a villa in Campania, and wrote a letter to Constantinople explaining that the Western Empire no longer required its own emperor. The most powerful political institution in human history ended with administrative paperwork. Rome, at its height, had held 1 million people within its walls. By 600 AD, that number had fallen to under 20,000. The infrastructure remained standing. The aqueducts still ran. The legal codes were still being copied. But the political fiction that had unified the Mediterranean world for 5 centuries had quietly dissolved, not in a single catastrophic moment, but across generations of institutional rot so gradual that the people living through it barely noticed it happening. The mechanics of the unraveling are as disturbing as the ending itself. In the final century of the Western Empire, 26 emperors rose and fell in 50 years, most removed by their own military. The Roman army had become more than 60% non-Roman by the 5th century, its loyalty purchased rather than inherited. The lead acetate the Roman elite used to sweeten their wine, identified by historian John Scarborough in 1984 as a probable source of chronic poisoning, may have contributed to the cognitive deterioration of the ruling class across generations. The empire wasn't stabbed, it was slowly hollowed out from the inside. The detail that historians find most unsettling is what Odoacer actually did after deposing the last emperor. He didn't declare a new empire. He didn't burn Rome. He wrote to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople asking for permission to govern Italy as a client king under Roman authority. Constantinople said yes. What we call the fall of Rome was, technically, a polite administrative restructuring agreed to by everyone involved. The civilization that had defined the Western world for 5 centuries didn't end with fire or conquest. It ended with a letter. And the most extraordinary thing is that almost no one at the time seemed to think that was strange. The Song collapse. The last Song emperor was 7 years old. When the Mongol fleet closed in at the Battle of Yamen in 1279, a loyalist minister named Lu Shufu gathered the child in his arms, walked to the edge of the ship, and stepped off into the South China Sea. Historical records suggest that 100,000 civilians, soldiers, and court officials followed them into the water rather than surrender. The greatest dynasty in Chinese history ended not with a throne room ceremony, but with a mass drowning. The Song had built something extraordinary. At their peak, they governed the most sophisticated economy on Earth, an empire whose GDP historian Angus Madison estimated at 30% of total global output. They had invented gunpowder, the magnetic compass, movable type printing, and paper currency. Their cities were the largest and most administratively complex in the world. By any reasonable measure, the Song were centuries ahead of every other civilization on the planet. The Mongols had none of those advantages when they began their campaign. What they had was the willingness to learn. Kublai Khan's forces absorbed Song engineers, adopted Song naval tactics, deployed Song-built siege weapons, and eventually used Song-designed ships to destroy the Song fleet. The most technologically advanced civilization of the 13th century was dismantled using its own blueprints. The northern half of the empire fell to the Jin dynasty in 1127, forcing the court south in a traumatic retreat. The southern Song rebuilt, reformed, and held for another 150 years before Yamen finally ended it. The deepest irony arrived after the conquest was complete. The Mongol Yuan dynasty, having destroyed the Song, immediately implemented Song financial systems at scale. They minted paper currency across the empire using methods the Song had pioneered, and then drove the currency into hyperinflation through overprinting, destabilizing the economy they had inherited. The conquered civilization's greatest financial innovation became the engine of its conqueror's eventual undoing. The Song invented the tools of modernity and watched those tools be turned against them. Their story is not a story of failure. It is a story of what happens when ingenuity alone is not enough to survive the people willing to weaponize it. The Aztec defeat, Tenochtitlan. In 1519 was a city that had no business being as large as it was. Built on a lake in the middle of a highland valley, connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways, it housed between 200,000 and 300,000 people, making it larger than London, larger than Rome, larger than any city in Europe at the time. When the Spanish arrived, the soldiers in Hernán Cortés's company reportedly wept at the sight of it, unable to believe such a place existed. 80 days later, they burned it to the ground. The standard story casts the conquest as a meeting of iron and obsidian, a technologically superior European force overwhelming a warrior society that had never seen a horse or a cannon. That story is almost entirely wrong. Cortés arrived with 508 soldiers, 16 horses, and 14 cannons, an absurdly small force to threaten a population of hundreds of thousands. The real weapon wasn't steel. It was smallpox, introduced in 1520, which tore through the Aztec population with catastrophic speed, killing an estimated 40% of the city before the final siege even began. And the decisive military force wasn't Spanish. The Tlaxcalans, longtime enemies of the Aztecs who had spent generations resisting Aztec dominance, contributed up to 100,000 allied warriors to Cortés's campaign. Without them, the conquest fails entirely. The last Aztec ruler, Cuauhtémoc, was captured after the fall of Tenochtitlan, tortured by Cortés to reveal the location of hidden gold, and executed in 1525. But what followed his death was arguably more violent than anything that had happened during the war itself. Bishop Juan de Zumárraga, in 1529, ordered the systematic burning of Aztec codices, the painted books containing the civilization's astronomical knowledge, religious history, medical practices, and legal records. Almost everything was destroyed. Only a handful of manuscripts survived. Mexico City was then constructed directly on top of Tenochtitlan, stone by stone, temple by temple, building over the physical evidence of what had existed. The Aztecs were not just defeated. They were deliberately unmade, their knowledge burned, and their city buried. We don't know what the Aztecs fully knew, because the people who defeated them made absolutely certain we never would. The Yuan collapse. He had been a beggar before he was a monk, and a monk before he was a bandit, and a bandit before he became the man who destroyed the largest empire the world had ever seen. Zhu Yuanzhang, born to a peasant family so destitute that his parents starved to death when he was a teenager, rose through decades of rebellion to become the Hongwu Emperor, founder of the Ming Dynasty, and the man who ended Mongol rule over China in 1368. His trajectory from orphaned farmhand to emperor remains the single most improbable rise in Chinese imperial history. The Mongol Yuan dynasty had controlled China for less than a century, but the scale of what they governed was staggering. The empire of Genghis Khan and his descendants stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Vietnam, the largest contiguous land empire in recorded history. Kublai Khan, who established the Yuan dynasty in 1271, inherited a China that was already the most administratively sophisticated civilization on Earth. The problem was that the Mongols, despite their military brilliance, were constitutionally unwilling to govern it the way China had always governed itself. Mongol administrators restricted the Confucian civil service examinations for decades, cutting off the pathway through which educated Chinese men had governed for 1,000 years. They maintained themselves as a separate ruling class, treating Chinese subjects as administratively inferior, and printed paper currency inherited from the Song at volumes the economy couldn't absorb, triggering the hyperinflation that destroyed the merchant class. When the Yellow River flooded catastrophically in 1344, displacing millions of farming families, there was no functional administrative system left to manage the crisis. 17 separate Red Turban rebel factions rose simultaneously across the empire. The dynasty that had conquered the world couldn't suppress a peasant uprising. The ripple of the Yuan's collapse reached further than China. The Black Death, which killed 1/3 of Europe's population, originated in Mongol-controlled Central Asia and spread westward along the empire's own Silk Road trade routes. The Yuan's disintegration didn't just end a dynasty. The plague that traveled the roads the Mongols had built became the deadliest pandemic in human history, reshaping European civilization for centuries. One empire fell, one continent burned, and the man who started it all had been begging for food 15 years earlier. The Acadian fall. 4,000 years before the Roman Empire existed, there was already a world. Sargon of Akkad built it around 2334 BC, carving out the first true empire in recorded history from the competing city-states of Mesopotamia. His empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, administered through an innovation no civilization had attempted before. A centralized bureaucracy governed by appointed officials loyal to a single ruler rather than to local kings. For 180 years, the Acadian Empire was the most sophisticated political entity on Earth. Then, around 2154 BC, it simply stopped. The fields were left unplanted. The cities were abandoned. A 300-year silence followed. Before the collapse, Mesopotamia was the engine of the ancient world. The agricultural surplus of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys fed populations that scribes, soldiers, and administrators built civilization upon. The Acadian capital of Agade was so wealthy that later Sumerian texts described its grain piled higher than the city walls. The system worked because the rains came, the rivers flooded on schedule, and the soil gave back what farmers put into it. That assumption turned out to be the empire's fatal vulnerability. Geologist Harvey Weiss of Yale University published sediment core data in 1993 from Tel Leilan in Syria, showing that a catastrophic 300-year drought began precisely at the moment of the Acadian collapse. Volcanic ash layers in the same soil horizon suggest a massive eruption, possibly from Iceland's Mount Hekla, triggered a climate shift that turned the agricultural heartland of the ancient world into a wasteland. The evidence was written into the earth itself, a layer of wind-blown dust with no human artifacts, no pottery, no ash from cooking fires, nothing for 3 centuries. What the Sumerians wrote about the collapse is its own kind of disturbing. The Curse of Agadi, composed shortly after the fall, doesn't describe drought or famine. It describes the gods abandoning the city, the fields producing saltpeter instead of grain, the fish dying in the rivers. They watched their civilization collapse, and their only framework for understanding it was divine punishment. They had no concept of volcanic winter, no model for climate catastrophe. They could only conclude that the empire had done something to deserve it. The first empire in history didn't fall to a conqueror. It fell to the sky, and the people it left behind spent 300 years in silence, unable to explain why the world they had built simply stopped working. The Khmer decline. In the 12th century, the city of Angkor was something the medieval world had no vocabulary to describe. 1,000 square kilometers of temples, reservoirs, roads, and suburbs housing up to 750,000 people, the largest urban area on Earth before the Industrial Revolution. The temple complex of Angkor Wat alone required more stone than all the Egyptian pyramids combined. And yet, by the 15th century, the jungle had reclaimed it so completely that the outside world forgot it had ever existed. It took laser technology mounted on aircraft to find it again. The Khmer Empire built its civilization on an engineering miracle. The monsoon rains of Southeast Asia are ferocious but unreliable, flooding fields in one season and withholding water entirely in the next. The Khmer solution was a hydraulic system of almost incomprehensible scale, a network of massive reservoirs called barrays, each capable of holding billions of liters of water, connected by canals that distributed water across the agricultural plain with mechanical precision. The system didn't just feed the city, it defined it. Without the hydraulic network, Angkor couldn't exist. Damien Evans of the French Institute of Asian Studies published LiDAR survey results in 2016 that changed everything historians thought they knew about Angkor's extent. The laser mapping revealed an entire hidden urban grid beneath the jungle canopy, roads, canals, and suburbs that archaeologists had never seen, confirming that Greater Angkor was even larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. The same data also showed the hydraulic system in catastrophic disarray, silted channels, broken embankments, infrastructure that had been maintained for centuries and then abandoned to collapse. Sediment analysis confirmed the mechanism. Extreme monsoon flooding in the 14th century, followed by prolonged drought, had overwhelmed a system that required constant skilled maintenance to function. The LiDAR data revealed something the Khmer themselves may never have understood. Angkor's agricultural demands were so intense that the surrounding forest had been systematically cleared for farmland over centuries of expansion. That deforestation destabilized the watershed, making the hydraulic system increasingly difficult to regulate. The empire may have consumed the environmental conditions that made it possible. The Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya sacked Angkor in 1431, but historians now believe the city had already been emptying for decades before the military defeat. The Khmer elite had relocated to Phnom Penh, closer to maritime trade routes. The conquest finished what environmental collapse had already started. The largest pre-industrial city on Earth didn't fall to an army. It was abandoned by an empire that had quietly outgrown the land's ability to sustain it. The Assyrian fall. Nineveh in the 7th century BC was the kind of city that made every other city feel provincial. 150,000 people lived within its 80-foot walls, which stretched for 12 kilometers and opened through 15 monumental gates. The Assyrian Empire behind those walls had controlled the Near East for 3 centuries, through a policy of calculated terror so systematic it was effectively the first doctrine of psychological warfare in recorded history. Mass deportations, public executions, and the deliberate demolition of conquered cities' walls were not byproducts of war. They were the policy. Assyria maintained its empire by making resistance unthinkable. That strategy worked until it created enough shared hatred across the ancient world to unite every enemy it had ever made. The Assyrian deportation records, written in the characteristically boastful language of their royal annals, document the forced relocation of millions of people across the Near East over 3 centuries. Entire populations of conquered kingdoms were uprooted and resettled in distant provinces, their homelands repopulated with strangers. The Assyrians calculated that people severed from their land, their kin, and their cultural identity would be incapable of organized rebellion. They were correct about the mechanism and catastrophically wrong about the timeline. In 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians, peoples that Assyrian policy had spent generations brutalizing, converged on Nineveh and destroyed it in 3 months. The destruction was so total that 2 centuries later, Alexander the Great marched his army past the ruins without recognizing that one of the greatest cities in the ancient world had once stood there. Nineveh had been erased from living memory within 2 generations. The rediscovery came only in 1847, when British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard excavated the mound of Kuyunjik in modern Iraq and found the buried palace of Ashurbanipal. What he found inside changed the study of ancient history permanently. The Library of Ashurbanipal, 30,000 clay tablets containing virtually all surviving Mesopotamian literature, had been preserved by the very fire that destroyed the palace. The heat baked the clay. The destruction of Nineveh accidentally created the best archive of ancient knowledge that archaeology has ever recovered. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest written story, the first flood narrative, the earliest recorded meditation on mortality, survived because someone burned the library down. The empire that ruled through terror was so completely erased that the most important library in the ancient world was waiting in the ruins. And the only reason we can read it is because the fire that was meant to end it made it permanent instead. The Bronze Age collapse. In the span of roughly 50 years, every major civilization on Earth simultaneously ceased to exist. The Mycenaean Greeks, who had built the palace culture that Homer would one day mythologize. The Hittites, whose empire had fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC and controlled Anatolia for centuries. The Canaanite city-states, the Cypriot kingdoms, the coastal trading cultures of the Levant. Gone. All of them. Between approximately 1200 and 1150 BC. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse. After more than a century of serious archaeological investigation, they still cannot agree on what caused it. The ancient world of the late Bronze Age was the first experiment in globalization. Egyptian pharaohs exchanged diplomatic letters with Hittite kings. Cypriot copper moved by ship to every corner of the Mediterranean. Tin from Afghanistan traveled through dozens of hands to reach bronzesmiths in Greece. The entire system was sophisticated, interconnected, and extraordinarily productive. It was also, as archaeologist Eric Klein argued in his 2014 book, breathtakingly fragile. Klein proposed a systems collapse model, the theory that no single cause destroyed the Bronze Age world, but that climate change, drought, earthquakes, famine, internal rebellions, and the mysterious migrations of the Sea Peoples all struck simultaneously, overwhelming a network too interdependent to absorb any single catastrophic failure. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was burned around 1180 BC and never reoccupied. The last document ever written at Ugarit, a clay tablet found in an unfinished kiln, is a desperate letter from the king asking a neighboring ruler for ships. The enemy ships are already here. Writing systems vanished. Linear B, the administrative script of the Mycenaean Greeks, disappeared for 400 years. Egypt survived, but its administrative output collapsed by an estimated 70%. The international trade network that had connected the ancient world took 300 years to partially reconstruct. The Sea Peoples, named in Egyptian records as the invaders who swept through the eastern Mediterranean during the collapse, remain completely unidentified. Decades of scholarship have produced theories, but no consensus about their origin. They appear in Egyptian carvings, described in royal inscriptions as a catastrophic maritime force, and then they vanish from the historical record as completely as the civilizations they helped destroy. The most disturbing detail is the pattern of the destruction itself. Cities destroyed early in the collapse sequence show evidence of military assault. Cities destroyed slightly later show signs of fire with no bodies at all. People had evacuated before the attackers arrived. Whatever was coming, enough people could see it coming to run, and it destroyed the ancient world anyway. The Indus Valley disappearance. 5,000 years ago, in the floodplains of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, someone built the future. The cities of the Indus Valley civilization, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, foremost among them, featured standardized brick sizes used consistently across a territory of 1.25 million square kilometers. They had indoor plumbing, covered sewage channels running beneath the streets, a citywide drainage system more sophisticated than anything Europe would build until the 19th century. At its peak, the civilization housed 5 million people across more than 1,000 settlements, making it larger by area than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. And then, between 1900 and 1200 BC, they dissolved. Not conquered, not burned, not displaced by catastrophe. They simply dissolved. No other ancient civilization disappears quite like this. The Mycenaeans left destruction layers. The Hittites left burned capitals. The Aztecs left a conquest narrative, however one-sided. The Indus Valley left almost nothing that explains the ending. There are no mass graves with trauma markers, no weapons caches, no fortified military architecture, remarkably, at sites like Harappa. No depictions of armies or battles anywhere in the visual record. For a civilization of 5 million people that persisted for 700 years, the archaeological signature of organized violence is essentially absent. It is one of the most anomalous silences in the entire human record. Climate scientist Liviu Gheosan of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution published research in 2012 showing that the monsoon system feeding the Indus agricultural network weakened progressively beginning around 2000 BC. Rivers migrated. The consistent water supply that had made large-scale urban agriculture possible in a semi-arid landscape simply shifted away. The population didn't die. Archaeological evidence shows a gradual eastward migration toward the Ganges Plain over generations, a slow dispersal rather than a catastrophic end. The cities didn't burn. They emptied, the way a glass empties when you stop filling it. Archaeologists have never identified a royal class in the Indus Valley. No palaces, no king's tombs, no monuments to named rulers, no evidence of the divine kingship model that structured every other major civilization of the ancient world. The urban planning, with its standardized construction and public infrastructure, suggests a degree of collective organization almost without parallel. What governed these cities and how remains entirely unknown. The writing system they left behind contains approximately 400 symbols, inscribed on thousands of clay seals found across the full extent of the civilization's territory. It has never been deciphered. Linguists, mathematicians, and cryptographers have spent decades on it. The script remains one of the longest undeciphered writing systems ever found. 5 million people built a civilization that lasted 7 centuries and left behind a written language we cannot read a single word of. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what they believed. We don't know what their kings, if they had kings, were named. We don't know what story they told about their own origins. They built the world's first planned cities, the world's first urban sewage systems, and possibly the world's first civilization, organized without the hierarchy of divine rulers and military force. And then they walked away, over centuries, in almost total silence. The absence of violence in the record doesn't make their disappearance less disturbing. It makes it more so. Every other civilization we study left behind the marks of what destroyed it. The Indus Valley left behind only the marks of what it built, and a language no living person can translate. There is a pattern running through every civilization on this list, and it is not the one that history textbooks prefer to teach. The textbook version of civilizational collapse is a story of strength and weakness, of superior forces overcoming inferior ones, of inevitable progress interrupted by avoidable failures. What the actual record shows is something far more unsettling. The most sophisticated, the most innovative, the most administratively advanced civilizations were not protected by their sophistication. The Song invented the tools that defeated them. The Acadians built an empire on assumptions the climate made catastrophically wrong. The Indus Valley constructed the ancient world's most equitable cities and vanished without leaving a single legible explanation. The Bronze Age built the first global economy and watched it collapse faster than anyone could respond. Complexity, it turns out, is not armor. It is sometimes the precise mechanism of vulnerability. What these civilizations leave behind is not a warning about weakness. It is a warning about the fragility that lives inside every system that is working exactly as designed. If this made you see the ancient world differently, consider what else we might be misreading. Subscribe, and keep pulling at the threads that don't quite fit the official story.